When news first broke of Israel bombing Iran, the Western media repeated the line that this had nothing to do with the United States. The White House had been briefing that they wanted Israel to hold off attacking Iran until after negotiations between the two countries had concluded. And most journalists appeared to take that at face value, like The Economist defense editor Shashank Joshi, speaking here on the BBC.
Firstly, your headline thoughts about what's happened overnight.
Well, first of all, this is perhaps something of a surprise because it preempts US-Iran nuclear talks that were due for this weekend. So clearly, Israel preferring the element of surprise rather than waiting for those talks to conclude. Secondly, the Americans very, very clearly stating that they were not involved and trying to stay out of this, although they may well be dragged into the aerial defense of Israel from any retaliation.
Now, that was a line you heard across the airwaves this morning. I don't want to sort of single out Shashank Joshi from The Economist, but this is what I heard when I was waking up to the Today programme. Oh, this was done without the US's say, so they were actually sort of kind of asking Israel to hold off, but Israel did it anyway. Some people suggesting that Netanyahu's actions might even have annoyed the Americans. That narrative, though, became harder to sustain after Donald Trump posted this. So he said, 2 months ago, I gave Iran a 60-day ultimatum to make a deal. They should have done it. Today is day 61. I told them what to do, but they just couldn't get there. Now they have perhaps a second chance. Right, so he's saying, I knew this was going to happen all along. In fact, this was part of my plan. So why had everyone got the wrong end of the stick? Well, according to the website Axios, Trump acting like he wanted the Israelis to hold off bombing Iran was actually all part of a carefully planned ruse. Axios laid out what was the received wisdom before this morning. So say friction point, even as President Trump pursued a nuclear deal, Israel was preparing for this strike, gathering intelligence, positioning assets, and eventually conducting drills. Those preparations alarmed some in the White House, who worried Netanyahu might move even without a green light from Trump. Netanyahu assured Trump he wouldn't. The White House, for its part, told Netanyahu that if Israel attacked Iran, it would do so alone. Trump himself said several times in recent days, including several hours before the strikes, that he opposed an Israeli strike that could blow up the negotiations. So this is what the received wisdom was. Before this morning, the Americans saying, we really don't want the Israelis to... The Americans, saying they don't want the Israelis to go ahead and do this yet because we're in the middle of negotiations. Then, though, Axios shows us what was the reality, or what they've been suggested by some sources was the reality. So they say the intrigue. In the hours after the attack began, Israeli officials briefed reporters that this was all coordinated with Washington. 2 Israeli officials claimed to Axios that Trump and his aides were only pretending to oppose an Israeli attack in public and didn't express opposition in private. We had a clear US green light, one claimed. The goal, they said, was to convince Iran that no attack was imminent and make sure Iranians on Israel's target list wouldn't move to new locations. Netanyahu's aides even briefed Israeli reporters that Trump had tried to put the brakes on an Israeli strike in a call on Monday, when in reality the call dealt with coordination ahead of the attack, Israeli officials now say. Aaron, I want to bring you in on this. This is quite extraordinary, right? So the argument being made here is that both people in Israel and the United States were briefing the press that Donald Trump didn't want Israel to attack Iran. But the only reason they were doing that is because they didn't want to tip off the Iranians that Israel were about to attack them. So Trump was essentially sort of lying to the whole world to try and trick the Iranians not to move their military commanders and their nuclear scientists away from where Israel would know they were.
Well, I think there's two levels to the answer, really. Did Trump want this to happen? We don't really know if the Americans wanted it to happen. They certainly didn't stop it, which would suggest they were indifferent at best about it. And they certainly knew about it. Given the noises that Trump has made in regards to how, Israel will follow the orders of Washington, I mean, that certainly is at odds with the kind of narrative we've had since Trump really, stepped into the White House, the Oval Office, in the last 6 months. He was meant to be this break, and in some ways he has been a break with the foreign policy preferences of the US deep state. When it comes to Israel, he absolutely has not been. He categorically has not been. On Syria, there was clearly a bit of a divergence with preferences that you might say come up the Democratic Party, foreign policy establishment, a few other places too, obviously Russia, Ukraine being the most famous one. But when Israel's involved with regards to the specific conflict of Israel and Iran, it's play for play, the exact same thing that would have happened with the Democrats. Hear no evil, see no evil. Behind the scenes, you work together. It is extraordinary, given that Trump said such sort of, kind words to the Iranians in many ways. And of course, we were about to have these negotiations. He's saying, we gave you 60 days. It's day 61. I mean, it really is low and quite despicable, Michael, ahead of negotiations to do what has happened here. And one of the people that has been killed overnight, a former advisor to, at the time, President Khatami, widely regarded as the most progressive president of the Islamic Republic since the revolution of 1979. The president, of course, is the highest elected office in the country. A former advisor to him was being interviewed in American media, I think a week or two ago, and he said, we're looking forward to these negotiations. If all the sanctions are dropped, we will absolutely end any kind of nuclear enrichment tonight. We will do that tonight. And I would suggest, Michael, that man is now dead, right? A very senior operator in Iranian public life, like I say, a senior advisor back in the day to Khatami. That man is now dead, not because Iran is developing nuclear weapons, but precisely because it was willing to forego the development of nuclear weapons for reintegration back into global civil society and the elimination of sanctions on the Iranian economy. That's why he died. That's why this attack happened. Not because Iran was going to get nukes, but because it was willing to give those up. Quite extraordinary. And it really flies in the face of the whole logic, right, of people like Trump. We're willing to work with you guys if you give us what we want. This man was literally on US TV saying, we'll do it, we'll go there. He's now dead. He's now dead. He was killed in his bed at night. What does that say about America? What does it say about Israel? And what does it say about these alleged, and we'll talk about this more in a moment, these alleged ambitions for peace and avoidance of conflict? Israel is seeking conflict out. It's actively pursuing conflict here. And the Iranians aren't. As Daniel Levy said at the top of the show, the Iranians can't, more importantly. People are saying that Iran has a right to defend itself. It does, by the way. Under international law, any country has the right to defend itself. The point is, so far, and this may of course change, so far it can't. Quite extraordinary to not just lose civilians, and many civilians have died overnight, many, many more wounded, dozens of people have been killed, including I've seen a 25-year-old woman, a teacher, and a poet. Many people have been killed, but to lose your top layer of political, but more importantly, nuclear science and military figures, senior person in the Artesh, senior people in the IRGC, but also the Quds Force, and of course, Qasem Soleimani was the top guy of the Quds Force, the extraterritorial element of the IRGC. Those people all killed. So Iran, yes, has a right to self-defense, but it can't defend itself. It can't defend itself. So that's why it was willing to go to the table. People overtly said that, literally to American news anchors, they're dead.
Let's look at how the Europeans are responding to this. You can kind of guess, can't you? Keir Starmer said this. The reports of these strikes are concerning, and we urge all parties to step back and reduce tensions urgently. Escalation serves no one in the region. Stability in the Middle East must be the priority, and we are engaging partners to de-escalate. Now is the time for restraint, calm, and a return to diplomacy. So you remember when Iran sent over those missiles to Israel in that retaliatory strike, Keir Starmer held a press conference in front of the nation, in front of British flags, where he sort of referred to Israel as a woman. He was saying she has a right to defend herself, and Britain is going to stand here against this despicable aggression. When Israel bombs and actually kills loads of people in Iran, Keir Starmer says, let's reduce tensions. He doesn't mention Israel. The word never appears there. I have to say, though, Keir Starmer's wasn't the worst response to this. Macron's, I think, was worse. He said, France has repeatedly condemned Iran's ongoing nuclear program and has taken all appropriate diplomatic measures in response. In this context, France reaffirms Israel's right to defend itself and ensure its security. To avoid jeopardizing the stability of the entire region, I call on parties to exercise maximum restraint and to de-escalate. So it reaffirms Israel's right to defend itself. It wasn't being attacked. Israel was the aggressor. The idea that Israel has a right, I'm going to punch my neighbor and then ask for your sympathy and say I have a right to defend myself. You weren't attacked. The German one was even worse, actually. I didn't get around to putting it in the script, but the German foreign minister was saying that this was brilliant what Israel had done because Iran wasn't following the nuclear non-proliferation agreement. Israel has nukes. Israel has nuclear weapons. Everyone's just completely ignoring the fact that Israel, against the terms of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Agreement, built its own secret nuclear arsenal. Before I go to you, Aaron, I want to go to a couple of clips because the deeply ingrained affinity to Israel, of the European establishment. So even when they obviously break international law, was made really clear on the BBC today. Not by the BBC, but by a guest of theirs. It was on The World at 1, in an interview with Sir John Scarlett. He's the former head of the MI6.
The key element for Israel and Israeli thinking here is the threat posed to them, and it's really important to get and so on, as well as the killing and destruction.
Now, I suppose I'm just wondering whether you think that those sorts of things were part of the careful...
No, I don't necessarily. The point is that the key element for Israel and Israeli thinking here is the threat posed to them, and it's really important to get into the thinking here, to understand what is in the mind of the key decision makers. And the Iranian nuclear capability, the possibility that Iran would acquire a nuclear weapon, which is being talked about in detail now, of course, week by week and so on, is an existential issue for Israel. And it's not just the government of Netanyahu, it's the state of Israel. And right the way across the population, I think you'll find that there will be a wide level of support amongst even people who are opposed to Netanyahu in other respects for this action. And if you see what Netanyahu said this morning in his statement, he used the word existential. That's a pretty big word. It brings into question, or it could bring into question, the security and the existence of the state of Israel.
And I was listening to the interview live today, and I found the whole thing really interesting because he is, the former head of the MI6, that is sort of the deep state personified, right? So that's sort of how the non-political or the supposedly non-political parts of the state are thinking. And he just over and over again said, we have to put ourselves in the heads of the Israelis. The Israelis see this as an existential threat, the idea that Iran could get nuclear weapons. Not once did he say, why don't we put our minds in our heads in the minds of the Iranians, right? Who have this power next to them, which is actually nuclear armed, which keeps killing all of their generals, right? He's sort of saying, no, we really do have to put ourselves in the minds of the Israelis here. They see this as an existential threat. Netanyahu said existential threat. Now that's a big word to use. Netanyahu says all sorts of bloody goddamn things, right? The idea that we have to take this so seriously, and any concerns that anyone else in the world might have, screw them. There was some sense being spoken on the airwaves today by, again, I suppose is a former ambassador part of the deep state, not so much as a former chief of the MI6. But anyway, this is the UK's former ambassador to Iran, Richard Dalton.
The country that has nuclear weapons is, of course, Israel. And the Iranians have neither the capability nor the intention to attack Israel using nuclear weapons. There was no threat of imminent attack, no credible evidence to present to the rest of the world by Israel, and peaceful means to remove the threat from Iran's eventual potential decision to have nuclear weapons, a decision it has not yet taken. Those negotiations were ongoing. So by every single criterion, Israel is in breach of the international legal requirements for justification of a preemptive attack. This is an illegal aggression.
I mean, he put it well. I suppose potentially if he was the former ambassador to Iran, he's someone who can actually have some empathy with Iranian people, which sort of Macron, Starmer, the former head of the MI6, just seem not just incapable of doing, but incapable of even considering that it might be appropriate to try.
Michael, there's so much to think about here. There is so much to think about here. John Scarlett, who, like you say, he's the head guy at the Britain Security Services, MI6. It's extraterritorial security services. The head guy, he doesn't say what's in this for Britain. What does it mean for Britain? He goes, you have to think about the Israelis. Why do I have to think about the Israelis? Why? Equally, why do I have to think about the Iranians? People are in Britain listening to that. Why do they don't need, they want to know the facts. They want to know what's happened. And maybe, obviously, they want to know about human rights abuses, illegality, etc. Of course, nobody mentions that. This is literally a declaration of war. Israel is now at war with 4 or 5 countries in the region, but it's fine. It's all self-defense. It's Orwellian doublespeak. But also, what does it mean for me? In this country, migration is one of the biggest issues for voters out there. Iran has a population of 90 million people. If Iran becomes a failed state, which, by the way, Netanyahu wants to make it a failed state. That's what he wants to do. He wants to get rid of the regime. When you do that, things often go very badly wrong. Millions of Iranians will go to Europe. Maybe that should figure in John Scarlett's thinking, Michael. And I find it quite extraordinary. We hear this time after time. Oh, well, these people coming in the small boats are economic migrants, right? And I'm sure some of the Iranians that come to the UK are economic migrants. They're not persecuted minorities, I'm sure. But it strikes me as rather ridiculous to say to people, you're economic migrants, but at the same time, think it's legitimate to bomb their country to smithereens until it resembles Lebanon or Syria or Afghanistan or Ukraine, and also have some of the most stringent sanctions in the world on that country. But apparently they're economic migrants. Would you want to live in a country with those conditions placed on it? Would you want to live in a country where your neighborhood is bombed, where your friends and family are in fear every night because of drone strikes in your city? Would you want to live there? Where you can't get a job because the economy has been systematically strangled for 45 years by the world hegemon and by its allies? I wouldn't want to live there. That's my first point, Michael. Then on France, on Germany, on Starmer, the same point. Why aren't these people talking about their national interest? And again, I'll return to that point. Iran, 90 million people. Egypt, 100 million people. Pakistan, 250 million people. You would think, best part of 450 million people, best part of 500 million people, throw in Yemen, throw in some other countries too. 500 million people. You would think, given the salience of migration and displaced peoples amongst European electorates, you would think that the Germans, the French, the British would be quite worried about, the potential for a failed state and then near abroad. But they're not. They're not. Their first thing somehow, and this doesn't make any sense to me, Michael. This is going to be, scrutinized by historians in decades to come. They're going to say they had absolutely no inclination to examine their own national interest. And these guys, particularly the middle great powers of Europe, France, Britain, Germany, benefited to an extraordinary extent from the global international law sort of architecture, post-war architecture. They were fundamentally massive net beneficiaries of that system. Why on earth did they allow a country of 10 million people to smash up this global international order, which massively benefited them? Why do they do it? It doesn't make any sense. And of course, you take a step back, here's why it happens, here's how it makes sense. Your entire political class has been parasitized by the Zionist Israel lobby over decades, including people like John Scarlett, to the extent where they can no longer even comprehend their national interest here. They can no longer even think about, okay, well, what does this mean long-term strategically for Britain? Charles de Gaulle, a centre-right politician, a right-wing political figure, Charles de Gaulle would not be responding to this like Macron. He would be looking at this and saying, okay, well, what does this mean for France? No European politician today, no major European politician today, is capable of thinking like that. It's incredible, Michael. And it really underscores the fact that we do not have national political leaders in Europe. On technology, on politics, on economics, we do not have national political leaders. We have vassals, okay? We have effectively viziers who act at the behest of US empire. And of course, in West Asia, Israel is the underling par excellence of US empire, so we have to support them. What hope do Iranians have, Michael, in all of this? Civilians, I don't mean RGC or Artesh people, or even nuclear scientists. What hope do ordinary Iranians have when the British government won't even condemn Israel for killing British nationals in Gaza? 3 former service personnel were killed by the IDF. They knew they were aid workers. And the response from the British government at the time said, investigate yourselves. So if the British government won't even stand up for its own people when they're killed by the IDF, what hope do civilians in Syria or Yemen or Iran or anywhere else for that matter have? They have no hope. And it goes back to the point I made earlier on, Michael, about supporting Novara media. The entire media in this country, and there are some momentary exceptions like that guest there a moment ago, but the default prejudices, biases, and perspectives of the media in this country have been massively shaped by the Israel lobby. Massively. They're incredibly good at what they do. In the last parliament, 70% of all Conservative MPs were members of Conservative Friends of Israel. How about you be friends of the constituency you represent? Suella Braverman seems to have more time on social media to talk about Israel having a right to self-defense than about the state of her constituency, which I've been in. It's not great. It's actually looking pretty bleak there when you walk down the high street. Of course, that doesn't matter to her. She can't grandstand over that. We have major problems with politics in this country and across Europe, Michael. Like I say, it goes back to the caliber of our leaders, which is itself an outgrowth of US empire. And I'll finish with this. You said about Israel is not a signatory in terms of non-proliferation. It unilaterally developed nuclear weapons. It did all the things that apparently Iran has done. A few points. First of all, Israel has ICBMs. It has intercontinental ballistic missiles, which means that it can target any country on earth. Not just countries in West Asia and the Middle East, not just Iran or Iraq or Syria, anywhere on earth. Theoretically, Israel could strike Britain or France or Canada or the UK or Russia or Australia or wherever. Why? Because the Israeli political establishment doesn't have allies. It has interests. If tomorrow the preservation of Israeli power and the extension of national ideology meant that they had to target a country in Europe, and from a calculative point of view, it made sense for them as a country, they would do it. So we've allowed a country to defy international law repeatedly, to oversee war crimes, in the words of a former Israeli prime minister, not mine, ethnic cleansing and genocide, and to not only develop nuclear weapons in breach of international law, but to also have the means to deliver those nuclear weapons anywhere on earth. At the same time, Iran, apparently developing nuclear weapons, according to Benjamin Netanyahu, since the early 1990s. It's always next week, next week, next week. Presumably it was going to be this week. That's why they had to do what they did last night. Iran has actually not developed nuclear weapons because, and this is the thing again, you won't hear this in the media. You will not hear this in Britain's media because everybody in this country's media repeats what they heard from somebody else. They are incredibly incapable of original thinking. Iran hasn't developed nuclear weapons, in part because of the hesitance, and I'm not a fan of the guy, of Iran's supreme leader, Khamenei. There was a fatwa by Khamenei against the development of nuclear weapons and indeed civilian nuclear technology at one point. There was a fatwa. So this idea that Iran is developing nuclear weapons, it has to be stopped. There are people in Iran, military political elites, that want to develop nuclear weapons. The supreme leader has been a handbrake on that. He's been a handbrake on that. This is well documented. Google it. Fatwa Khamenei nuclear weapons. Google it. People have written about this at Harvard University. This is not coming from Novara media. Where are you going to hear that in the coverage of this stuff? Absolutely nowhere. Absolutely nowhere. And to conclude, as I've said, that is a reflection of how the Zionist lobby understands that hybrid war, more than ever before, places a huge emphasis on the information area. Information war is critical to how it does geopolitics, how it conducts foreign policy. They view that as being just as important as the F-35s and the drones and the military supply chains and, you know, an effective conscription mechanism with regards to their young people and military orthodoxy with the IDF and all those things. Probably more important is their ability as a country to shape the informational space of countries like the UK. Critical to them. And that's why we exist.